myth in the Bible. We're in part 5 today, and we're going to be having a look in depth to some of the very, very early accounts of the Baal cycle. And this we all do in our endeavor to investigate this idea of Leviathan, some ancient dragon, serpentine-like figure that's often a personification of chaos or of the chaos seas that we find in the Bible. Now, last week we had a quick look at some of these type of myths found in Sumer, ancient Mesopotamia, from the 3rd millennium BC. And then we had a look at the Babylonian version of, or variation of this, the god Marduk, and in his attempt to become king of the gods, he has to slay this saltwater sea type of thing, dragon that he slays, cuts in half, and kind of creates from there, and then gets a temple for his efforts in Babylon. And then lastly, we had a very quick look at the Ugaritic Baal cycle. And we also made the point that very early on, scholars started to identify that what we find in the Bible with regards to Yahweh slaying some type of sea monster, etc., linked to creation, seems to be there's a shared motive in the ancient Near East that does not exclude the Israelites, but very specifically that the Israelite version of this is way or much closer linked to the Ugaritic Baal Canaanite version of Chaoskampf than the Babylonian. Now, although we do find very, very similar motifs in Enuma Elish, and you can spend time looking at them, it seems like the Israelite version is in some ways based on an earlier, of course, Canaanite version which came to light in the Ugaritic literature from Ugarit, ancient city of the Mediterranean, just a little bit north from places like Tyrus, Sidon, and so on. So it's in the Levant, northern part of the Levant, right on the Mediterranean coast. We also had a look at why scholars today think that the Israelites were essentially in culture, in religion, in material culture, in script. They were basically descendants of the Canaanites, the very early Israelites. Now, this stands in some way in contrast to the biblical narrative we get from Moses and the Exodus. That, in some sense, the biblical narrative is telling us or tells us that the Israelites were wholly foreign to Canaan and came out of Egypt, all of them, the whole bunch of them, about 1 million of them, and they invaded Canaan and took over the whole place. And from there on, it was the major struggle between the Israelites trying to, or God trying to, through the prophets in most cases, and some of the kings, prevent the Israelites from falling into Canaanite adultery. In other words, the worship of the Canaanite gods and their type of religion. It unfortunately is the reality that the archaeology points in a different direction. The archaeology points in the direction of the fact that Israelites were in fact considered Canaanites, and it was a group of Canaanites that separated themselves from the Canaanites, and we mentioned some of the reasons for that during our last session, and that the prohibitions on Baal worship, etc., was it was a mission of distinction from an earlier version of Canaanite worship, and not so much Baal worship was not an intrusion, but it was something that was already there that needed to be eliminated within the Israelite camp. Right, so today we are going to have a look at some of these very, very early myths that are found in the Ugaritic Baal cycle. And here we want to take some time to just look at some of the details. And today is basically going to put before you some of the reasons why people say, and why I think this is true, that the Israelite myth of God slaying the Leviathan or the dragon or the sea, which is called Yam, in the Hebrew Bible, comes from the ancient Canaanite ideas. All right, so let's have a look at a closer look at some of the ancient Canaanite myths. So Baal versus the sea god Yam. So one thing we need to know, as we mentioned last time, is that it seems like Hebrew is a younger version of Canaanite, a development out from the Canaanite language, which is what we call the Western Semitic, or is it Eastern Semitic languages. And so we're going to find cognates. Cognates are, for instance, words that Leviathan found in Hebrew is the Lotan found in Canaanite, right? So they're related in the same way, maybe like, I'm going to give an example. If you move from Dutch to Afrikaans, for instance, there'll be words, they're not exactly the same, but they are the same word, just in the different language, but their relationship is quite obvious. I'm trying to think of, uh, I can't think of an example, sorry, but I think you could probably think of some yourself. So a cognate then is the Hebrew version of a word that we find in the Canaanite language. Um, right, so this is one of the ways in which we can see and follow how this idea developed out from Canaanite literature into the Hebrew language. So one of these ideas is the sea god Yam. So in the Canaanite pantheon, you had El at the top, and then you had Baal, and you had Yam, and you had Mot, and you had Anat, and those seems to be the most um, prevalent gods. And then you also had El, who had a consort of some point. In other words, like a wife, Asherah. And it seems like El and Asherah, they brought forth these other gods. Now, of course, Baal becomes the most notable, and now we know kind of why, because in the ancient Ugaritic mythology, Baal fights Yam, the sea god. He fights him, and then he conquers him, and then he has to go fight Mot, death. And actually, Mot ends up killing Baal, and Baal gets resurrected by his sister Anat. And at this point, it seems like Baal then becomes the king of the gods in a sense. He doesn't really replace El, his father, but he becomes like a deputy of some sort, an executive over the gods. Baal, of course, also one of his greatest claims to fame is that he was a storm god. Now, storm gods were very, very important in the Levant because, unlike the other areas of Mesopotamia and Egypt, where the rivers flooded to create the fertilization of the crops, here in the Levant, the rains were responsible for fertilization of this agrarian society's crops, and this is what kept them alive. In other words, if you were in good stead with the God who brings the rains, the God who comes on the clouds, who sends thunder and rain, if you were in good stead with him, he would give you moderate rains for your crops to be fertile and for you to be able to continue to survive. If you were not, this God would separate himself from you. Sometimes it was explained as he's going to sleep, and if he sleeps for a little bit too long, what you end up with is famine, which kills everybody. But on the other edge of this scale is if he gets angry, and you can just imagine if you've been in a storm before and you have these dark clouds and thunderings and rains, this God is angry. You can imagine if you really believe there's a God doing this, the dread of this presence of this God around you, knowing that at any moment you could be struck dead by the lightning or drown in the flood or whatever it might be. If this God were to get very, very upset, he could also use the rain, which he would normally use to fertilize your crops and keep you alive. He could use it to flood you. He could use it to wash you away completely. And as far as I understand, ancient Levant was prone to these types of heavy storms and flooding. You could somehow tie that to the Great Flood in some sense, but that's not for today. So the point is that Baal became, due to his war with Yam. Now, Yam is the name of a sea god, or it's a personification of the sea as a god in the mythology, and he fights this thing, and when he conquers this thing, the result of all of this is that Baal then becomes the king of the gods. So it's a different version of the Chaoskampf in some sense, that the Enuma Elish version produces or is very strictly linked to creation, and then after that the establishment of Marduk as king of the gods in some sense over the Babylonian pantheon. Here in the Ugaritic tablets that we have, Baal becomes the son of Baal, a son of El, that is lifted up in authority because of his great conquest. Now, what is his conquest? His conquest is this massive fight with Yam, um, the sea. And I just want to mention at this point that we have this word in the Bible. Now, sometimes the word in the Bible for waters or for sea is something different. But in specifically these accounts that we've already looked at, like Psalm 74, the word used is actually Yam, which, if you just think about that for a little bit, you realize that there's some connection here. Although we read it as sea and it's translated as sea, is a much closer connection with the earlier versions of a kind of a mythological idea of God fighting the sea. But let's leave that at that. So let's start with this fight between Baal and Yam, the sea god. All right, so one of the pieces of the puzzle in the story of Baal's defeat of the sea god Yam survives in fragments only for us in the Ugaritic tablets written in cuneiform on clay tablet type things. But we have some of these fragments, and according to these fragments, we can kind of see what the story or the mythology or the myth looked like. Baal, the storm god, and Yam, the sea god, they are both vying for kingship of the gods. So you have this rivalry between Baal and the sea, or Baal and Yam, if you like. So Yam first gets the upper hand over Baal. But then there's a craftsman god, a lower god, which is his name is Kotha. He makes two magical weapons for Baal. These are clubs, as far as I understand. The first one he gives to Baal. Baal uses it and he fails. But the second one of these magical weapons given by Kotha to Baal works. And this is where, let me quote from the Ugaritic for you. This is obviously an English translation, but it goes something like this. The club swooped from Baal's hand like an eagle from his fingers. Beautiful. It struck the crown prince Yam between the eyes of Judge River. Yam collapsed and fell to the earth. His joints quivered and his form crumpled. Baal dragged out Yam and put him down. He made an end of Judge Nahar. All right, so a couple of things we want to note from here. Baal is in conflict with Yam, the sea god, but there's a double here that the sea god Yam is also called the Judge River. And this is an important thing to note. There's some type of equivalence between the sea and this river or rivers that's found here in the Ugaritic Baal cycle. We have other fragments, other stories that tell us different versions of the same thing, as far as I can understand. But then the goddess Astarte then declares Baal as the winner, and this goes like this. She says, Yam is indeed dead. The sea is indeed dead. Baal shall be king. So Baal becomes king of the gods by his Chaoskampf, by destroying the sea in this way. Now, although this topic is a story of kingship rather than creation in the Ugaritic literature, there are clear links with the biblical creation passages me and you have already worked through in session 1 or 2 of this series. For example, Yam, meaning sea, is a personified name in Psalm 74:13. So it could read like this. Now, this is Psalm 74:13. You, meaning Yahweh, you did break. The word break here means you did divide. The word divide here means to break, to defeat, etc. And coincidentally, this word particularly for divide here is only used. Let me see what I've written here. Divide as an interpretation is only used once, and that's here in this version. The word has a very strong meaning of defeat, injure, or to break something, right? So it goes like this. You did divide, break, defeat, the sea. And the Hebrew word there is Yam. This can't be a coincidence. It says, by your strength, you break the heads of the dragons in the waters. So this is a portion from Psalm 74 from the Hebrew Bible, in which it seems to be clear that once we know of the Ugaritic cycle, which is much older, at least 1,000 years in terms of writing, as far as I can understand, the Hebrew Bible here is echoing the myth of the Baal cycle. That just like Baal defeated sea Yam, so also Yahweh by the strength of his hand defeated Yam. Now, what is interesting here is, are there two seas? And these were two separate fights. And I think a proper study of this eventually leads you to realize that Yahweh started absorbing the attributes of Baal during the periods of the early Israelite literature. In other words, what the Israelites started doing was they were starting to lift up the idea of Yahweh as king of the gods. Um, and Baal was a rival to that. And so it seems like, on the Mackie today, it seems like the writers of the early literature of the Israeli scriptures absorbed the epithets, the languages and the motives, the pictures and the motives for Baal onto Yahweh. Um, so that they painted in this way, consciously or subconsciously, they painted Yahweh as a replacement for Baal, or a rival at least for Baal, but someone that then ultimately overtakes Baal and takes upon him all the motives that was previously in Canaan applied to Baal. So it seems like these motives are quite familiar to the writers of the Israeli Bible. There are some scholars that say that some of these psalms actually could have been originally written in praise of Baal and were adapted into the Hebrew psalms now for Yahweh by the Israelites. So the other thing we note here is we possibly have like a type of Hebrew parallelism, which is a form of poetry for the Hebrew literature, where Yam, as a sea god being defeated in the first line, is equated to breaking the heads of the dragons in the waters. Um, so this is something we have seen, is that there's this kind of equivalence or a personification of some sort, an identification between the sea as a god or as a chaos motif, and in a more literal, in a more visceral version, this is personified as an actual dragon fighting from the sea. And in this case, which is very interesting, we need to keep this in mind as we move forward. It says here that Yahweh breaks the heads, plural, of the dragons in the waters. And this seems to imply some form of a plural-headed type of a monster, sea monster that we have here in Psalm 74. So, and just as Yam is called Judge River in the Ugaritic text, the Bible often depicts the rivers along with the sea as a vanquished foe of Yahweh. So, an example of that is found in Nahum 1 verse 4. It says, He, which is Yahweh, rebukes the sea, Yam is the Hebrew word, and he makes it dry. He dries up all the rivers. Another version of this is in Nahum 3 verse 8. It says, Was the Lord Yahweh displeased with the rivers? Was your anger against the rivers? Was your wrath against Yam, against the sea, that you did ride upon thy horses and thy chariots of salvation? So another thing which is interesting is that just like the Ugaritic myths connect this idea of sea and rivers together, so the Bible does the same. Right. Now we need to just talk quickly about, do we have another? Yes, okay. We're going to be quoting another version of the Baal cycle, this time where it explicitly mentions the Leviathan. So most of the tale of Baal's victory over the sea is lost, but we have other sources that confirm that this tale actually existed. References to this tale survives among the tablets that were excavated at Ugarit. In one such text, Mot, which is the god of death, recounts his fight with Baal. Quote from the Ugaritic text: Because you smote Lotan, which is the Canaanite cognate for Leviathan, the twisting serpent. So here, Leviathan in the Ugaritic text is connected to or explained, figured as a twisting type of a serpent figure. And you made an end of that crooked serpent. So he's called a twisting serpent and a crooked serpent. That's Leviathan here. He says, the tyrant with 7 heads. The skies will become hot and will shine, dot, dot, dot. All right. So we have a reference in the Ugaritic language of this Leviathan. So before this time, we kind of could have made some assumptions about Leviathan being a dinosaur, being a whale, or some pet sea thing in some animal made by God in the beginning, which is what a lot of fundamentalists do. But now that we know that the Leviathan is actually part of an ancient Canaanite myth, and in this myth, the Leviathan is called or understood to be like a crooked or a fleeing or a twisting serpent that has 7 heads. Now, this is interesting because, as we mentioned last time, we have a little plaque from ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia where what we understand to be the god Ninurtu is fighting a 7-headed dragon. And he then continues to, in this little plaque, you can see him slicing one of the heads of this dragon. So the idea of a 7-headed dragon is not something that's new or novel to the ancient Mesopotamian mythology. It's there, and it's also present in the people very close to Israel. And as we now, by this point, are just going to assert in the ancient religion of the Israelites, in early Yahwism, which would be very close to ancient Canaanite, this would have been something they would be very, very familiar with. And that's the reason why we have Leviathan appear in books like Isaiah and Job, and is pictured as God, Yahweh, slaying this dragon, hurting it, damaging it, breaking it. It is not something new to the Israelites. It's something they grew up with, if you like. It's the way they understood that order came to the cosmos, and that's the way how a god becomes powerful as king of the gods. He has to deal with chaos. He has to deal with Yam. He has to deal with this kind of like a 7-headed monster from seas. Okay, so I want to mention just quickly and go back and quote from Job and also from Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 27, verse 1. We have spent some time on Isaiah 27, verse 1, acknowledging that this is a motive used by the writer here in the 8th century, possibly denoting God's future vengeance against the Assyrians that at that point was about to and possibly had already taken the northern tribes into a type of exile, or just completely overpowered them and demolished them, and we never hear of them again. So although we acknowledge that this is a kind of a prophetic type of scripture, we have to also acknowledge that it's using the motive it's very familiar with, that in the past God has slain this Leviathan dragon sea, and he will do it again. And in this sense, like he's using it prophetically now, Isaiah, to picture God fighting his enemies in the future. Let me just read again for you Isaiah 27, verse 1. In that day, the Lord, with his sore and great and strong sword, will punish Leviathan, that piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he will slay the dragon that is in the sea. All right, so what we have here is a very, very clear data point that the writer of Isaiah understood the Leviathan to be a piercing and a crooked serpent. Like this is almost word for word what we find in the Ugaritic, that Leviathan is a twisting serpent, a crooked serpent, a thing with 7 heads. Isaiah doesn't say how many heads, but that's kind of irrelevant at the moment. Isaiah acknowledges that this monster type thing is called Leviathan, that it's a crooked serpent, it's serpentine, and that it comes out of the ocean. So it seems to be very clear just from this point that the biblical writers, and therefore in some sense the Israelites, were very familiar with this type of myth. They did not invent it. It's not just metaphor. It comes from the ancient mythologies of the Levant. Now let's quickly have a look again at Job 26, 11 to 13. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his reproof. He divides the sea with his power. Now you can read it, he divides the sea with his power, just like, oh yeah, God parted the sea, but it's drawing on something much bigger and much older. God damages, breaks, bruises Yam, right? And by his understanding, he smites through the proud. By his spirit, he garnishes the heavens. His hand has formed the crooked serpent. So Importantly, here we realize that when most Christians hear the idea of the word serpent, they start projecting much later ideas back into these passages. For instance, and we're going to say a little bit about this a little bit later on, but I just want to mention it that it is, I believe it's incorrect to assume that every time we read serpent in the Old Testament, this is what New Testament people called the devil or Satan, or what modern Christians understood to be serpent in Eden. That connection is not made by the Hebrew Bible. It's not really made by Judaism at all. It is a later Christian interpolation or a retrojection. And we'll speak about that in a moment. The point I'm trying to make just simply here is that Isaiah and Job both are aware of these myths, and they use these myths um, and call it by name. A crooked serpent, Leviathan, exactly as the Ugaritic um, literature does. Another portion that remains for us to be read is the war goddess Anat, which is she was Baal's sister. She also participated in the battle, and in another ancient text, she says, "What enemy rises up against Baal? What foe against the rider of the clouds? Have I not smitten Yam, the darling of El? Have I not made an end to the river, the great god? Have I not muzzled the dragon?" This is the word Tanan, another cognate to the Hebrew, "and captured him. I did crush the crooked serpent, the tyrant with 7 heads." So here's another very, very clear example of, here we have words again, Yam, we have river, we have Dragon Tannen, which we explored quite a lot in our earlier series, found in the Hebrew scriptures. And here again, that he's called a tyrant this time, and he is pictured as that with 7 heads again. So it seems like a distinctive feature of the Ugaritic dragon, the Lotan or the Leviathan. It has 7 heads. And this is reflected for us in some sense in Psalm 74, where there is a reference made to plural heads of the Leviathan. All right. The other thing that your ears might have perked up at was the epithet for Baal as the rider of the clouds. Now, this is one of the most famous epithets for Baal because he was understood to be a storm god. As I mentioned earlier, storm gods were very important gods because life and death was in their hands. And although in the Canaanite pantheon, El was at the top of this pyramid with his wife Asherah or Astarte in some versions, El was the guy who decided who lives and who dies because he was a storm god as such. And as you can picture for yourself, storm gods were always associated with rain, with thunder, and with clouds. Um, so that Baal was understood to be the rider of the clouds. In other words, when you see the clouds coming on and there's a massive storm coming, as you might have been accustomed to in the ancient Mediterranean, they understood this as Baal is on his way, and who didn't bring their sacrifices? Who are we going to sacrifice to get rid of this guy? And as far as I understand, they often even did sacrifice children to appease these gods because of the devastating nature of these storms. It was better to let one child die than to let all of them die. So they were trying to appease the gods. But these storm gods were actually terrifying images and terrifying characters. They were temperamental. They were quick to act. They were vengeful. While El, the high god, was more someone that would sit on his throne, and he's the more wiser, more patient version. Uh, and that's why he was, he's the father of the gods, the ancient one. But El was quick-tempered. Baal, and he's literally the one that would eventually just, not eventually, but he would. His outbursts were outbursts of hail and fire and lightning and floods. So you didn't want to upset. You didn't want to upset him. All right. Now, um, the rider on the clouds. You might now also realize, if you've read enough in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, that this is also an epithet that is used of Yahweh, of the God of the Israelites, and quite a lot. God in the Hebrew Bible is pictured as one that comes on the clouds. He makes the clouds his chariot. Um, we'll have a look at some quotations now, but this is quite obvious that God is also depicted in parts of the Hebrew Bible. I would probably say the majority of the older versions of the literature as a storm god. This is not a new idea. None of the things I'm saying are new ideas. I'm regurgitating things that have been in the scholarly fields for probably from the early 20th century already. So these ideas are decades, a century old. Um, but scholars are very well versed in this. There's a lot of literature on this, and if you're interested in this, you could delve into it. But scholars are very, very clear on this idea that Yahweh is portrayed as a storm god for most of the Hebrew Bible. This is before we get to the era where he is starting to become a more monolatrist high god that exercises power over the other gods in the divine council, etc., etc. Okay, so let me quote one or two pieces from the Hebrew Bible to just quickly show that this is, in fact, a type of way that the Bible explains God. Psalm 68, verse 4: Sing to God, sing a praise of his name, extol him who rides on the clouds, rejoice before him, his name is Yahweh. Isaiah 19:1, a prophecy against Egypt. See, the Lord rides on a swift cloud and is coming to Egypt. Now, why would the Israelites have to depict God as coming on a cloud? Well, this is not just pure metaphor and pure poetic language. I think I've come to realize that the old people, the ancient peoples, they were not dumb, they were not less intelligent than us, but they really did have a very limited scientific understanding of how the world worked. To them, clouds were not um, condensating water vapor in the air that collects together and somehow then and thus can block out the sun and eventually produce the precipitation of rain. To them, these things were the actual manifestations of gods, and I think this is the reason why uh, the old language speaks of God in these terms. That the Israelite also, as the Canaanites believed Baal came in the clouds, in the same way, I think the Israelites also believed that when the clouds came, this was not Baal. No, 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 no. This was Yahweh. And he's coming to punish. So if when you see dark clouds coming, you know someone's going to get it. And they use that in the language against judgment, against Egypt, for instance, here in Isaiah 19, verse 1. Psalm 104, verse 3, he makes the clouds his chariot, meaning he's riding on them, like this is his transport. And it would not surprise me if this was really not a metaphorical understanding, but really a literal understanding in these ancient times. He rides on the winds, on the wings of the wind. Um, the storm god comes in the storm, and it is absolutely terrifying when this god visits you. Um, Also, together, an associated thing with this was, of course, lightning and thunder. Thunder becomes the voice, the anger, the flaring of the nostrils of this god, and lightning becomes a weapon, a very precise weapon, where rain is a more general buckshot type of approach. Lightning is a very precise sniper action that can literally kill someone or that can put someone's house on fire. Um, and so it seems like these ideas of wind and rain and fire and hail were actual weapons of these storm gods, and they were absolutely feared by the ancient people. The Hebrew Bible does not specify how many heads the Leviathan had, but the myth of the seven-headed dragon. Now, you might have already gone there in your mind, but I just want to mention it kind of briefly today, that in the New Testament, we have a seven-headed dragon, right? Um, hmm. Now, this is in the book of Revelation. Now, Revelation is easily understood as a kind of a reworked apocalyptic work of Daniel and Ezekiel, reworked in the New Testament with New Testament ideas in it. But if you think about what we're dealing with, we're still dealing with people, even in the New Testament, we still be dealing with people who is subscribing to a very, very ancient idea, the idea of Chaoskampf, that if they want to portray Rome, or, personally I believe it is talking about Rome in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, as the enemy, what do they use? They use Chaoskampf. They use the idea that God and his son on the clouds is coming to beat this dragon from the sea. This is no coincidence. There's absolutely no way that this is a coincidence. This is a pull through of one of the oldest and most ancient myths in the ancient Near East that settled and refined itself in Canaanite religion, that dripped across, or emerged still, or remained in the Israelitic transformation to Yahweh, and all the way across from the Old Testament into the New Testament, into a book that was probably written at the end of the 1st century AD. The myth is still in the minds of these people. I'm not saying they know or believe in the actual, by the time of the new century, that these people believe in an actual dragon. I actually don't think that. I think they're talking about the Roman Empire as this beast, the powers that be. But it is clear that they have no qualms using a myth to build it upon. So I'll leave that for now. Of course, let me just read a little bit of this. It's also not only found in the book of Revelation, but also in some other apocryphal Jewish literature, like the Odes of Solomon and the Pistis Sophia. In Revelation 1, verse 12, verse 3, it says, "And there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads." Alrighty then. "And I stood up upon the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads." There's no way this is coincidence. From Odes of Solomon, 22, it says, "He who overthrew by my hands the dragon with 7 heads." In other words, the point is that this myth did not die. It kept on reinventing itself into the Jewish mind, all the way through into Second Temple Judaism. It remained as a type of a meme in the minds of the New Testament Christians. And the final book of our New Testament Bible ends with this myth. How in the world is what's going on? I mentioned that Revelation is somehow a reworked apocalyptic, or a reworked version of the apocalyptic thought of Daniel and Ezekiel, which is found, of course, in our Hebrew Bible. And if you just for a moment take what happens in the Hebrew Bible, this in the book of Daniel, for instance, you have a God sitting on a throne who is called the Ancient of Days, something which El was also called. And his kind of like a sun figure comes riding on the clouds, and he's the one that's going to fight and bring the kingdom. Unfortunately, it just seems very clear to me that all of these things come from this oldest myth. And it is built upon the theology, evolves out from this myth. The application kind of changes. Like Isaiah might have meant his portion, Isaiah 27, to the Assyrians. Some of the other prophets might have applied it to Egypt. Later versions of, I think it's Jeremiah then, or Isaiah, I can't remember, but it's during the exile, might have applied it to Babylon. But in the New Testament, we have this, and then Daniel might have applied this to the Seleucid Greek Empire that was busy plaguing Jerusalem during the 2nd century. And now in the New Testament, we have the New Testament writers applying the same myth to the powers that be, which in this case, of course, in their case, was the Roman Empire. There is absolutely no way that this is a coincidence. This is a clear tracing of a myth right throughout the conscious, religious conscience of a people that starts off with how far you can go back. Let's start with the Canaanites, although it's probably older than that, in this 3rd millennium BC, or let's say 2nd millennium BCE, all the way through into the 1st century, through the Israelites, into the first Christians. And believe it or not, even today, this myth is still present. It's still present in the minds of people. It's the end of the world, and God has to fight demons. And we've translated it slightly, because what New Testament writers did different to the other applicators or the appliers of this myth is they made a connection between this dragon, the chaos dragon, and the invention of Second Temple Judaism called Satan or the devil, this kind of an arch enemy of God that's not present in the early Hebrew Bible, but comes into being during Second Temple Judaism and becomes a main character on the scene of the New Testament. In fact, by the time that the New Testament is written, the Satan, Diablos, this arch enemy of God in charge of all the evil spirits, as the New Testament writers often say and mention, is now identified with this dragon. So that even today, most Christians believe that at the end of time, God is sending his son to fight the dragon. Okay, so it's just important that we know where this comes from and how we got here. Whether you believe it or not and how you believe it to be true is a completely different story, and that's not my job here. I just want to show that the ideas in Revelation are very well fitted with ancient myth. All right. So, just like some of the earlier writers of the Hebrew Bible, the writers of the New Testament will go on to use this ancient myth as an allegory for their own contemporary context, right? And today, we just change the nation that's in charge of this. That's Russia and this and that and Iran, and it's the same story over and over again. We're just reinterpreting this ancient myth for our contemporary context. But the New Testament writers in the book of Revelation, it was written by someone called John. We're not sure who wrote it. He was obviously called a prophet, but he uses this ancient theme to depict God's great enemy in the first century, which is, of course, the Roman Empire, according to the first century writer. In this new Christian interpretation of Genesis 1, the sea monster myth and a version of the second temple Satan, which is, as I mentioned, a demonic angel, they are conflated to become the snake in the garden. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that the snake in Eden, now from our very late perspective, is the chaos monster and is the devil altogether there from the beginning. But in fact, this is a much later understanding of what happened in Eden. It would be much closer to the historical context to understand that the serpent in Eden was a figure representing chaos, a figure representing chaos in the garden, this force of chaos that comes to bring chaos in the garden. And that's exactly, of course, what happens. I think a distinction can be made and understood that the chaos monster is not an evil thing. It's just chaos. And chaos, according to the very ancient mythologies, which I would include the Bible in this. In the beginning, there was God and chaos. And God beats the chaos to bring order. And that's what we find in Genesis 1. And even in the other older versions, like Psalm 74, God has to beat the chaos. But the chaos is there from the beginning. The chaos is not inherently evil. It is not inherently opposing God in that sense. But God has to deal with chaos in order to bring forth order. Where Second Temple Judaism, Satan or the devil, he is inherently evil, a created being, evil, that goes out. His main mission is simple: got to thwart God's plans, got to make all believers non-believe. It's a different character. It's a different thing altogether. But I think in Christianity, we have kind of put these two things together, and now we believe it's just the same thing. And I have to disagree with that. I think that's the result of retrojective interpretation. In other words, interpretations that come later, or beliefs that come later, that's projected back into the scriptures. The chaos monster is more neutral, is not explicitly evil, and was defeated. He was defeated to bring the world into order, not to be defeated again at the end, to expel order from the world, to expel evil from the world. They're two completely different concepts, and they were conflated together by a later Christian era. All right, I'm going to stop here now. Next week, I want to talk more specifically about some of the traits that are similar between Baal and Yahweh. And I want to highlight one, and that's the weapons, specifically the lightning spear, the use of lightning by the storm gods to show their power and punish people kill people. All right, so we'll have a look at that next week. Thanks for joining me. Cheers.